In this video, I will be discussing the key term, fascinating cannibalism, mentioned in our reading of the Third Eye intro by Fatima Tobing Roney. In her introduction, Roney explains the obsessive consumption of images of a racialized other known as the primitive is usually labeled fascinating cannibalism. She goes on to explain that the cannibalism is not that of the people who are labeled the savages, but actually of the consumers, who look at these images of the bodies as well as the actual bodies on display of native peoples offered up by popular media and science and are fascinated by them and continuously crave more.
Zigzagging my way through the American heartland, I'm hoping to make sense of the world's enduring love affair with the Hollywood Indian. In the movies, we're often portrayed as spiritual, noble, and free. This image has captured the world's imagination. This fascination with everything native begins with the very first explorers. They encounter hundreds of nations, rich and diverse cultures, languages, and beliefs. The world is hooked.
Native Americans were among the first subjects for films. Thomas Edison shot silence about Native Americans. This is in the late 1800s.
Thomas Edison unveiled his kinetoscope in Times Square, and it was a penny machine that played the Laguna Pueblo ceremonies and dances, and those were the very first moving images.
There were more than 100 silents made involving Native Americans, very much because this part of American history, of course, was really still ongoing at the time that cinema was really being born.
With populations dwindling, most natives are confined to reservations. Then, as film is being invented, the 7th Cavalry, in revenge for Little Bighorn, opens fire on the last free community of natives. 300 men, women, and children are killed at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation.
That is a genocide that occurred, and the culture wanted to perpetuate the idea that these people are now mythological. You know, they don't even really exist. They're like dinosaurs.
The reason that Indians were projected so heavily into movies was the romance of the tragedy. Greek, Roman tragedy.
The Western as a form is a very open form. It's a very pure kind of American metaphor, a kind of frame within which you can write or say all kinds of things.
I think that the cinema was created to film First Nations.
As the clip mentions, the birth of cinema and film is directly tied to people's need and want to see these native and indigenous peoples on the screen. And Roney actually touches on this when she says the 20th century is a century of the image of cinema. The 20th century is characterized by the accessibility, circulation, and popularization of mechanically reproduced images. She goes on to say that the 20th century is, in the words of Walter Benjamin, characterized by the desire to bring things closer, spatially and humanly, overcoming the uniqueness of every reality by accepting its reproduction. She goes on to say that the exhibited native villages of the World's Fair and the zoo, and those seen in National Geographic and of course photography and cinema, are really just entertainments that make it possible for these people to be seen more as a nexus between race and a past of origins. She goes on to refute Walter Benjamin's insight that the appeal of media like photography stems from the masses' desire to bring distant things closer. But she says that that does not adequately capture the masses' ferocious appetite for the images of people of color which these entertainments are making possible. In order to understand the early history of how indigenous peoples of color were represented in film, she says it is necessary to examine the obsession with and anxiety about race manifested in both science and mostly in popular culture. Roney concludes by mentioning one result of this ongoing division: the speaking for and thus the silencing of the peoples depicted in the ethnographic cinema. Her solution is understanding. Understanding produces a new way of looking at the images, one that can begin to bring the people who inhibit them out of their bondage of silence and into the present, one that acknowledges performance rather than the empirically represented primitives in the timeless picturesques. Okay, so fascinating cannibalism is the obsessive consumption by consumers and watchers of images and of film of native or indigenous peoples and how they look on film, how they act on film, how the actors portraying them look and act on film. And it's the obsession with watching them and how they are offered up by popular media and by science. And unfortunately, fascinating cannibalism is still seen today. We can see it in movies like The Lone Ranger and like A Million Ways to Die in the West. So I hope that you all understand this really important topic of fascinating cannibalism, and I hope that this video helped to further your knowledge.